We're here in Kensington, Minnesota, and on episode 2, we are going to dive into the history of the Vikings. We're going to look at their sagas, a little bit about their stories, and then look at their pre-Viking Age history as well as what happened during the Viking Age. So join us on episode 2.
So, as we've posted, if you've been following us, we've been talking about how difficult it is sometimes to know what people were like when they lived more than 1,000 years ago. They feel very distant to us and in some ways not real. But the one thing that we have to refer to try to understand who the Vikings were is the sagas that were written down from oral histories that they passed from generation to generation. And I've got a little excerpt of one here just to give us a flavor. I know it's summertime that this is actually a quotation about Yule season, which happened around the same time as Christmas, and it was a transition holiday when they were converted to Christianity that the Christians used to help culturally shift Vikings into the Christian faith. But this is before that time. It's about Eric the Red. We'll talk about him more. He's being hosted by some people, and he's been staying with them for some time. This man's name is Karlsefni, and he says he's getting downcast and kind of pouty, and Karlsefni asks him, "Why are you bumming?" And Eric says, "You've been kind and gracious guests, and it does not so much as enter my mind that you have treated me other than perfectly. What troubles me is whether once you find yourselves in other parts, it will be noised abroad how you never spent a poorer Yule than this now in coming in when Eric the Red was your host at Brattenhald in Greenland." So he's bumming because he's spending time with them, but he wants to show them hospitality because it's Yule season and that's what you do. So he's bummed that other people will hear that Eric the Red is actually not a hospitable person. It's a funny thing to be worried about, but it concerned him. And they're like, "Well, we've got lots of food, let's throw a feast." And they did. And it says that there was no feast like it that had been seen before in that area. And during that feast, this guy, Karlsefni, proposes to Eric the Red for Gudrid's hand. We're going to talk about Gudrid later as well. She's a female character that really stands out in the Viking tale, who later converted to Christianity. But he asks her for her hand in marriage. Eric says, "Yeah, I think you're the right guy for her." And he says, "Gudrid, what do you think?" And she says, "Sure." And so they make the wedding feast part of the Yule feast. Very practical people, but also very committed to partying and to hospitality. And Gudrid's remarked upon as being beautiful and accomplished, and that's the reason that this guy wants to marry her. But in the end, she shows herself to be much more than just beautiful and accomplished. She's got quite the character, exploration, wisdom, and courage. So these are just some of the things that we can read about the Vikings and get a taste for their culture and who they were.
I'm standing in front of a reconstruction of an 11th century Viking ship that was discovered off the coast of Denmark. And it's been donated here in Minnesota to the Alexandria Runestone Historical Society. The pre-Viking Age was steeped in mysticism and paganism and various rituals. It was a period of intense spiritual darkness. The earliest people in Northern Europe were sun worshippers and practiced fertility cult rituals. They were trapped in a world of intermediaries, casting runes, shamans, and sorcerers, offering animal and human sacrifices. Pagan temples were a place of bloodshed, ritualistic feasting, and obscene festivities. Their folklore taught them that they cohabitated the land with an invisible population of elves, dwarves, and spirits, trolls and ogres, and they held festivals in their honor and made offerings to them. Ancestors were revered and worshipped as part of their myth world. They were a hardy and determined people. They needed to be in order to survive in such a hostile environment where tillable land was scarce and the climate was cold with short growing seasons. The agriculture was their primary livelihood. They were also expert metal workers and with close trade links to Greece. Large deposits of precious metals in their burials from the 500 BC show that they were the richest culture in Europe at the time. Because of the limited trade resources in Scandinavia, they sought out trade routes with various tribes and were constantly warring against each other and with their neighbors. They had qualities of fortitude and bravery that made them formidable soldiers on land and sea. The strongest warriors, both men and women, were rewarded with a resting place in Valhalla, their mythical version of heaven. In the 6th and 7th century, the Norse engaged in trading, seafaring, and occasionally plundering. Trade networks existed with the Celtic and the Roman worlds, and they developed a robust maritime culture. Because of the climate and the layout of the land in Scandinavia with rugged mountains, there was not very much tillable land or easy passageway through those. So they traveled primarily by water and through the sea as their means of transportation. So they developed an overlapping plank design in their ships with clinker-built ships that allowed for longer and further voyages through the dangerous North waters. So all of these advantages in maritime travel brought about the Viking Age, which began in 793 with the sacking of the Lindisfarne monastery off the eastern coast of Britain. Several motivating factors led the Norsemen to leave their homes, some of them being overpopulation of the region where they were coming from. They wanted to seek fortune elsewhere. There was fewer women to marry due to the influence of infanticide of girls with the preference of boys to leave their inheritance to. And they desired riches, which Europe and primarily the church had in abundance at this time. So then at the turn of the 9th century, hundreds of Norse and Danish ships landed on the British Isles. From the east coast of England, the Vikings sailed north to Scotland and the Hebrides, eastward to Ireland, and around the Emerald Isle to the south side of Britain. They ravaged and plundered, artifacts were stolen, gold and silver hoarded, prisoners were ransomed or sold into slavery primarily to the Muslim world. In the early 9th century, the Vikings raided the Frankish kingdom. They founded the city of Dublin in Ireland. They plundered Nantes, France, and burned Hamburg, Germany to the ground. They also ravaged Paris. In 844, nearly 200 ships raided the Iberian Peninsula and sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar. They ended up raiding the northern coast of Africa as well as landing in Italy before turning home with their hulls full of gold and precious metals. On their way back through the Strait of Gibraltar, the ships were so laden with riches that they were moving so slow. The Muslims who were waiting for them, because they knew there was only one way back out the Mediterranean Sea back to the Atlantic Ocean, the Muslims were waiting there and they attacked the ships, and nearly 2/3 of the Viking ships were captured or destroyed in that time. The Old Norse Scandinavia was a culture established in tribalism. The chieftain led his people with a very stern hand. Law and order were very strictly maintained. Allegiance was to a chieftain, and so as long as the chieftain was able to provide payment and opportunity for raids and riches, he held the allegiance of those who went raiding with him. And this is different from England, where there was already a development of national identity and allegiance to a nation. And so your allegiance couldn't be as easily bought and swayed, whereas the Vikings were so. The Swedish Vikings were also called Varangians, and they penetrated the river systems to the east of the Baltic Sea. They established trading outposts from Poland to Crimea. Their expansive trade routes stretched from Constantinople to the Caliphate of Baghdad, and even as far as the Buddhist regions in India. The primary trade of the Vikings were slaves, northern furs, Frankish swords, and cloth. The Varangians were also called the Rus, meaning rowers. These Rus established a Swedish dynasty that captured Kiev and its surrounding lands that eventually became Russia. The Varangians made lighter ships to portage overland and sail across the Black Sea to besiege Constantinople. While unsuccessful in their attempt, the Byzantine Emperor, Basil II, was so impressed with their tenacity and their ability to fight that he established certain trade treaties with them and hired a number of them on as his personal cohort that became known as the Varangian Guard. Without the Viking longboat, there would be no Viking Age. It was this technological marvel that enabled the Vikings to hold maritime supremacy for over 300 years. Their ships were powered by both sail and oar. They were nimble and responsive and maneuverable. The overlapping plank design, clinker-built ships were extremely adept, enabling the Vikings to not only cross oceans, but be able to incurs into riverways as well. Light enough to portage overland, they were strong enough to carry an entire Viking crew along with their hoard of plunder. The manufacturing process of the sail itself would often cost just as much as the ship. Fleets could be small, comprised of only a few for specific raiding incursions, or they could be comprised of hundreds of ships for multiple confederacies of kings or chieftains as they invaded a continent. Besides the longboat, the Vikings also developed the knar, a merchant-style maritime vessel whose primary purpose was transatlantic voyage and trade. This transatlantic travel brought them all the way from Iceland to Greenland and even to the coast of North America. I have a quote here from an author who says, "The Viking ships were sailed with immense courage and skill by men without compass or chart, but inured to hardship and learned to sail in the sea's ways. They sailed by latitude and the sun and stars, by landmarks and the flight of birds, by the evidence of maritime creatures and the color of water, by rough or dead reckoning, by currents, by driftwood and weed, by the feel of a wind, and when needs be, by guess and by God."
I think it's important to understand when we're looking at the history of the Vikings and what they did and what motivated them to do what they did, is to understand their religion. Their religion was intensely violent. And as we know, culture is religion externalized. So their culture was violent as a result of their violent religion. Some aspects of their religion included no respect for human life. Their gods were, you may have heard of Odin and Thor and Freya and Builder. They were these, of course, imaginary beings who were all powerful, all controlling, and ultimately these gods planned on wiping out the entire human race. So the survival of the human race in the world was only a temporary thing. So to make the gods happy, human sacrifices needed to happen, because that would sort of delay the eventual wiping out of all humans. So that's sort of the source of the intense violence against human life. Their sacrifices read exactly like the Babylonian religions described in the Book of Kings. The Norse priests were wicked men who engaged in indescribable acts of violence. If they felt they were not being listened to or disrespected, they would tell someone, "Oh, it looks like you need to offer a human sacrifice," somebody close to them, often their children, just like in the Book of Kings. So we're talking about really sad, really deep spiritual darkness. And I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time on describing what they did. Some of it is just totally unnecessary, just unspeakably horrible. But the only reason I think it's important to address it is because right now in Hollywood, and if you read some modern historians, they're romanticizing this Norse mythology. And I mean, we have the Marvel films. Curtis and I watched one documentary that made the Christians look like they didn't know how to have a good time. They were somber. Literally, they described them as drab, and the Vikings knew how to have a good time. They were jolly and knew how to party. So I think it's important to know that they weren't just jolly innocents having a good time. They were steeped in deep spiritual darkness. And they engaged in vile lifestyles that gave them over to a depraved minds. So they killed baby girls, as Curtis mentioned. They preferred sons to daughters, so they killed their baby girls. They used women. They did not respect women. Men buried their sons with their treasure so that they believed that they needed somebody to escort their treasure with them to Valhalla, which was their version of heaven. So they would bury their sons with their treasure, just deep deception and darkness. It was really sad. Another aspect of it was trust. They were very deceptive, and no man could trust another man. It was based on power. So if one man was stronger than another, he would simply say, do this or you die. And the only reward for doing it was that their life was spared. So, like all of us, prior to God saving us, they were very miserable. They desperately needed salvation. And this is our segue into our next episode, where we talk about how God did exactly that in a really amazing way. All the technology and seafaring and the skills he gave them, God actually used instrumentally to pull them to himself and to work an amazing mission evangelism work throughout all of Europe.